So tonight's shir will be a little complex. I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can. It's not simple though.
Bring a master, from the Russian.
I'm not sure how Lemaiset is. We're going into different dimensions of Schia. But let me just show you where we are in Tosfos. This is where we got up to. Tosfos here on Samachet Amud Beis, Dima Masel Katan, which in my print is in 3 different levels. There's the skinny lines, the middle-sized lines, and the wider lines. So we're in the second of the wider lines. And we're up to V'im Tomer. Do you have that?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So that we have. So says the following. V'im Tomer Heichnis Gayer. So till now we've been talking about how a Katan could own Mammon, how the Katan could be Mechayev Shvua, and all this is Doraisa. But now we have to ask the question how a Katan could become a Ger. And that's a sugya here and also in a few places in Shas, but mostly in Ksubas on Daf Yud Aleph. He says the following. Ki amrinan nami de Katan isle schia midoraisa. Even if I grant you, according to that Mandi Omar, that a Katan could have schia doraisa, so somebody could do a maisa on behalf of Katan, if it's a schus, and the Katan will be socha, and that's doraisa. And that's based on the principle of Das Acheres Makna that we discussed at great length. But Hani Bili Yisrael, that only applies to a Jew. Why? Because a Jew is in the parsha of Shlichus, and therefore, if Zechia is mitam Shlichus, then Zechia could be operative on behalf of Katan if he's a Yisrael. Aval ove kochavim, but if this Katan is a guy, then the Gemara establishes in the Masechta of Metzia and Parakezu Neshech that a guy does not have shlichus. He'll never have shlichus, even if he's a gadol. And that's called Kevan Delo Asi Lechlal Shlichus. He will never have shlichus. The pasuk says Atem, and Chazal derive Gam Atem. That the Gam in the word Atem is coming to include shlichus, but the shliach has to be like Atem. He has to be a ben bris like the Mishaleh. But a guy will not have shlichus. And not only that, he will never have shlichus. So it's not like we could say about a Katan that in a case of Yisrael, he will have shlichus. It's Osi L'chal Shlichus. That's not the case in a case of a guy, because he won't ever have Shlichus. And therefore, less Schia, Afil Rabbanon. The Gemara says that you might have Schia D'Rabbanon with regard to someone who eventually will be included in Schia D'Oraisa, but someone who will never ever be included in Schia D'Oraisa. And that's true in the case of a guy, because since Schia is mitam shlichus, and a guy is mufka from shlichus, and he'll never ever become a bar hochi of shlichus, therefore, even on a drabanan level, we would not establish Schia on the part of a guy. Now, this is interesting because Tosfos at this point is implying that if Zechia would be operative midrabanan, that might solve his problem. I mean, we're talking about Geirus Doraisa, not Geirus D'Rabbanan. But we'll see Behemshech Hadvarim how this works in. Tosfos says the following: Umiu holav kushi. The fact that the ger is a guy at this point, and therefore, how could Schia operate on behalf of the guy when he will never be B'chlal Schia? That's a problem that we can solve. Because Halav Kushehi Diabkain Tikshilon Kol Gerim Hechmat Bilanosan. Every Geirus takes place in Bezdin. Bezdin is Megayer Goy, and the guy goes down to the mikveh. The Bezdin will supervise the Geirus, and we're operating with Zochen Liodom because Bezdin is going to be Zocher in the Geirus, meaning they're going to supply the Das for Geirus. Tos is assuming that Geirus needs Das, and the Das is going to be supplied by Bezdin, and that's Midin Schia, because in Schia, the Mezakeh supplies the Das for the Zocher. And you could ask in general, if Zechia is Mitam Shlichus, how could be Mezakeh any guy, which the whole enterprise of Geirus is now in question, because every Geirus means that Bezdin is Megayer the Ger, and that means that Bezdin is operating on behalf of the Ger, and they're applying the principle of Zechia. Zechia, in turn, is predicated on what? On Shlichus, and a guy cannot have Shlichus. So how do you ever have Geirus? Forget about the case of a Ger Katan. Even a Ger Gadol, the only way we can understand the Geirus is that we're Mezakem in Geirus, and we're supplying the Das for Geirus through Zach and Liadam. Well, that's predicated on Shlichus, and a guy can't have Shlichus. So what's the solution to the problem? What is the secret that underlies the entire enterprise of Geirus? That's called Zechiyaso V'Yado Boin Kiachas. That the ability for the guy to have a shliach, and therefore that we can be zachin on behalf, is going to be clinched together with the Geirus. That's called Gito V'Yado Boin Kachas, right? We have it in the case of a get. A man gives a get to the chotzer of his wife. How could she make a kinyan through her chotzer when kol mashekana isha kana baila, and it's really his chotzer? But we're going to say Gito V'Yado Boin Kachas, that together with the get, simultaneously she gets a yad, and therefore it's her chotzer, and she could be kona the get in her chotzer, and she's megureshes here too. Since the ger with the gerus will achieve shlichus, he'll become a bar hachiv shlichus, so that the zchia together with the yad of the ger to have a shliach, to have zchia, both emerge simultaneously. All that is fine if you're talking about a ger who's a gadol, a non-Jewish person who's a gadol. Aval I Katan lesle schia midaraisa vadai kosher hechnis gayer. Excuse me. However, in the case of a Katan, how could he be misgayer? Because what are you going to say? Zechia v'Yado Boin Kachas. What does that mean? He's still a Katan. Even after the Geirus is Chal, and he becomes a Yisrael, he doesn't have Zechia Doraisa. In other words, what we're saying.
He doesn't get Zechia after the conversion.
Are you with me on the Kasha Tosis? Or
Yeah,
you're answering the Kasha Tosis?
I'm just making sure I understand that. But you can't say one kachas for the kid, because even if the conversion works, he still does not have.
Right, he still doesn't have shlichus. Why? Because at that moment when the Geirus is chal, he's a katan, and a katan doesn't have shlichus, therefore he can't have schia. So if he's a gadol, okay, let's say he's 15 years old, immediately when he goes into the mikvah, he becomes a Yisrael, and he's 15 years old. He's a gadol, so he can have shlichus. He's a bardas, and therefore schia could work because simultaneously he gets his yad for shlichus and for schia. But in the case of a katan, what are you going to tell me? That immediately when he becomes a ger, he has a yad? That's not true. He's still a katan. So how does the enterprise of Geirus operate in the case of a ger katan, which is the sugya that we're learning here in Masechet Sanhedrin, that he's a ger katan? And basically what Tosfos is saying here is that if we're assuming, as the Gemara assumes in Perek Ezu Neshech, that a Katan cannot have Zechia because he cannot have Shlichus, then Geirus, which is predicated on Zechia, in the case of a Katan, he can't have Zechia. And therefore his Geirus is not Chal D'Oraisa.
Oh, we kind of see the runaway.
Now Tosfos is going to investigate the possibility that the whole enterprise of Ger Katan is only the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan can give him Zechia, and Zechia is going to operate the Rabbanan. He's a Ger the Rabbanan. You know, I'm wondering, how do we treat a Ger the Rabbanan if he's not a Ger D'Oraisa? You mean Igdu Yichol Limchos? Is that what you're talking about? Well, you're a few steps ahead of me. I'm just trying to figure out how this guy is a ger when, you know, when on the Dorais level he's not a ger.
The Judah Rabbanan. That's Jewish.
How does the mechanism work? Because the first milah and then there's tefillah.
Or first milah then tefillah, or maybe tefillah before milah. I mean,
No, whichever one.
right.
When it's half a thing, then he's doing it as a guy. I'm saying, as soon as you're buying Kecha can only happen once it's a full-fledged shoe.
Right.
So whichever one of these, so
let's say we need das for tefillah. Let's say. So they did the milah. Now we're ready for tefillah. We're going to supply the das.
yes.
And how do we do that? Because of Zach and Liada.
the
Wait, Zach and Liada, right? So we're going to supply the das. But that means we're operating as his shliach.
Right.
He can't have shlichus, and even after the Geirus is chal, he can't have shlichus. So how could Zechia work?
So it's about a cost, I'm saying even a
God.
gadol.
Gadol is okay because they were going to apply the din of Gita B'Yod Bar Kaf.
And what do we say about the milah that preceded it?
Mila is just to make sure that he doesn't have his orlos, and therefore the tefillah could bring him into Geirus. I mean, in the case of in the Keva, she doesn't need Mila, obviously, and tefillah clinches the Geirus. But this whole institution of a ger d'Rabbanan, that's really a fascinating concept. Let's go on. Yesh lomar kigon shenisgaira imo kishehimu beres. Kedamrina beperka orel eshes oved kochavim meuberes shenisgaira b'na ein tzarich tevila. So the Gemara establishes in Yevamos that if a woman who's not Jewish is pregnant and she undergoes Geirus, her child does not need tefillah, which means that the tefillah of the mother is operative, is valid even for the ubar, even for the fetus in her womb. And the fetus does not need to undergo Geirus, which means that the fetus, when born, is already Jewish. We don't have to apply the principle of Zach and Liodam Shlo B'fanav, because the mother's tefillah is meaningful and valid for the ubar. And so the Geirus is really the Geirus of the mother.
But if the Geirus is the Geirus of the mother,
Right.
then would the baby be born a Ger or a Jew?
The Ger. Because
Why
the
Ger?
Geirus is chal now on both the mother and the uber.
So
You would think that it's being
If you
born
get the
as a Jew.
status,
He
you
needs
get
to
the
be
status
born.
as an Ebor.
Right. No, he needs to be born in order to be a Jew. But with his birth, now the Geirus that he underwent before is chal.
there's a milah garus, a milah of a baby.
You're asking whether the milah now, after the baby is born,
Will be done.
is the milah of a Jew or the milah of a guy?
Yeah.
Is it the 8th day like a Jew, or is it a din of
Yes.
Geirus?
Not coming for Dr. Shabbos.
But
No,
some-
nafkamina would be, first of all, if you need a bezdin. I would assume you don't need bezdin. It's a regular meal. Because the child, through the mother's tvila, underwent Geirus. And the Geirus of the mother, with her das, is chal for the uber as well. So we don't need zach and liana. It's not that someone is supplying the das on behalf of the ger, but rather the Geirus is one Geirus of the mother together with the uber.
It's interesting that he's considered a ger, even though he's born to a Jewish mother. So he can marry Mamzeres? This is considered a ger?
He's a ger go,
but it's not
and he's a ger doraisa. And it's not through zach and liana shlobafana.
This is the case of ger Khan Derais at this stage.
I'm missing Ellie tonight. He usually gives me a couple hours. All right. Anyway,
We can call
what do you say?
him. We can call him, man.
Yeah, I give a shir here on Wednesday mornings in the senior kollel here. But they have hot water going constantly, so at this big mecham. Anyway, so what I want to learn with you tonight is a kasha of Rabbi Kiveger. Rabbi Kiveger, in his chidushim on Ksubis, on the sugi of Ger Katan, asks a kasha. And we want to study this kasha. In a few places in Shas, the Gemara records a machlokes whether uber yerech imo or uber lav yerech imo. It's hard to say what the final conclusion is, but probably it's uber lav yerech imo. In any event, Rabbi Kiveger asks the following question. Tosfos, in order to establish that there is such an enterprise as Geirus Doraisa, that's not predicated on Zechia, because Zechia cannot operate on behalf of Katan. Tosfos needs a case of a Muberes Akum, and she undergoes Geirus. So Rabbi Kiveger claims, and Lechori is 100% right, that this premise of Tosfos can only operate if you hold uber yerech im. Let me explain. He thinks that Tosfos, he's accusing Tosfos, so to speak, of basing himself, of standing on the shoulders of that man the who holds uber yerech imo. Rabbi Kiveger understands that if uber lav yerech imo, then the uber has to undergo his own gerus. If I hold uber, bishlema, again, I'm sort of adding an inflection into a little music into Rabbi Kiveger. Bishlema, if you hold uber yerech imo, then the uber is part of the mother, and as such, the mother's gerus is chal even vis-a-vis the uber. But if you hold uber lav yerech imo, that means the uber is a separate entity. Then the uber requires its own gerus, and if it requires its own gerus, then the mother's gerus is going to be related to the uber only through zach and li'olam shelo b'fanav, meaning the das that we need for gerus, which cannot be supplied by the uber, because an uber is a lav bar das, has to come from the mother. If it's one gerus for both the mother and the uber, and that's called uber yerech imo nicha, then I understand that we don't need a separate gerus for the uber, and therefore we don't need a das of the mother to relate to the uber through zach and li'olam shelo b'fanav, because it's one gerus. But if I hold what? Uber lav yerech imo, which means that the uber is a separate entity, then as such the uber needs and requires its own gerus. So now the mother can achieve that gerus on behalf of the uber, but only through the mechanism of what? Of zach and li'olam shelo b'fanav. That her das is going to now supply the das for the gerus on behalf of the uber, and that works midin zach and li'olam shelo b'fanav. But then we're back to square one, because Tosfos says that's chiyah lav doraisa, because we're talking about a katan, and we're talking about a situation where even after the gerus is chal, the katan is still a katan, a lav bar das, and the only way of implementing this and having the das relate to the katan is through the mechanism of zach li'olam shelo b'fanav, which is predicated on shlichus, and a Katan can't have shlichus. Who asked this kasha? Rabbi Kiva. And this kasha is especially difficult if the halacha is that ubar lav yerech imo. But even if the halacha is ubar yerech imo, we have machlokes in the Gemara many places in Shas. I'll mention one or two examples. And you've got to answer the question of how the enterprise of Ger Katan could exist according to both Man Diomer. You can't just write off one Man Diomer and say, well, if I hold ubar lav yerech imo, then we're basing the Geirus on Zachin, and Zachin is Lav Doraisa, and therefore there could be no Geirus in the case of a Katan. We know that Ger Katan is Doraisa. So how does Ger Katan come to be Doraisa? It's got to be predicated on Zchi if I hold Uber Lav Yerech. That's all you fact, Reb Kiva. And of course, he ends up with Tzarchi Yigol. He doesn't answer the question. So what I'd like to bring tonight is a chiddush from my Rebbe in the name of Reb Chaim, in which Reb Chaim is going to ask the same kasha as Reb Kiva on a different sugya, and the answer to that kasha in a different sugya is going to supply an answer to Reb Kiva in the sugya of Ger Katan. Does everybody follow my structure?
Didn't answer the question himself.
Yeah, he answers the question, but it's interesting that it's interesting that he proves his point based on another sugya. In other words, that sugya must be predicated on a particular understanding of uber lav yerech imo. And once you define uber lav yerech imo properly and accurately, then Rabbi Kiva Eger's kasha falls by the wayside. That's the exciting enterprise that we want to study tonight. The sugya of Reb Chaim is in Yevamos Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Beis. The Gemara says the following: a non-Jewish woman was pregnant with twins, 2 boys, and the Gemara wants to know, when these 2 boys are born, right? So she was pregnant with 2 boys, and now she's misguided. And the Gemara wants to know, what is the relationship between these 2 boys when they're born? Are they considered achim? Which would mean that, well, let's say we gave names at the Geirus, Reuven and Shimon. Now, Shimon gets married to Leah. If Reuven is a brother to Shimon, then there's an erev relationship between Reuven and Leah. That's called a shis'ach, and vice versa. And to quote the Gemara says, Shnei achim ta'omim gerim, shal rasam shalo b'kedusha. In other words, she was already pregnant when she underwent Geirus. That's called Hora'asam Shalo b'kedusha. At the time of the conception, she was a non-Jew. V'leidasam b'kedusha. In other words, she was miskayeres as a mu'uberes. Chayavim mishum eishes ach. Which means what? It means that they're considered brothers. For Dini Arayas, they're considered brothers. And for Yibum as well. That's why the Gemara is in Masechet Yevamos, to tell you that if after Shimon gets married to Leah, he dies without children, then Leah falls for Yibum to Reuven, because they're 2 brothers. And now we're ready for Reb Chaim's kasha, which is the identical kasha of Reb Kiva in the sugya of Ger Katan. Frekt Reb Chaim, I don't understand. That makes a lot of sense if you hold Uber Yerech Imo. If Uber is Yerech Imo, they're brothers because they belong to one Geirus. But if you hold Uber Lav Yerech Imo, and then there's a separate Geirus for the aim and for the Uber, in this case, for each one of the Ubrim, then we should apply what principle in Geirus? Correct. That's called what? Yeah, I'm just asking for the... It's excellent. Ger ki katan shenolad. So a ger is not related to any other people on the face of the earth until he gets married and has his own children, blah, blah, blah. But he's not related to any of his biological relatives, al pi din. And therefore, if there's a separate Geirus for Reuven and a separate Geirus for Shimon, and we're going to assume that somehow the tefillah of the mother will set up a Geirus for Reuven and for Shimon, that's called Uber Yerech Imo, then I understand very well that if it's one Geirus for all of them, then they are considered brothers. But if you're going to hold Uber Lav Yerech Imo, and now there's a separate Geirus for the mother and for the Ubar and for the other Ubar, in this case of Ta'omim, then we're going to apply the principle of Katan Shenolada. And therefore, there's no relationship between Reuven and Shimon. That was Reb Chaim's kasha in Masechet Yevamos. And based on this kasha, Reb Chaim concludes that we don't understand what Uber Lav Yerech Imo means. And he revolutionizes to see a so gadol, Uber Lav Yerech Imo, which is Noget, has so many sugis and shas. And he says the following: the machlokas between Uber Yerech Imo and Uber Lav Yerech Imo is about the question of whether or not the Uber is a separate goof, which would mean in the case of Geirus that the Uber requires a separate Maisa Tefillah, and the Tefillah of the goof of the mother is not the Tefillah of the goof of the Vlad. Why? Because Uber Lav Yerech Imo means that they are gufim mechulakim. That's Reb Chaim's language. Gufim mechulakim. However, Reb Chaim argues, based on this Gemara in Yevamos, that even though gufim mechulakim, and we're going to define the Maisa Tefillah of the mother as a separate Maisa Tefillah for the Ubar and for the other Ubar. Again, you have to know about Chatzitza here. So that's a complicated issue because it's Rubo Sheno Makvid and so forth and so on. But be that as it may, if there's no Chatzitza, and the Gemara is assuming that the Tefillah is operative even on behalf of each one of the Ubrim, and therefore the Ubrim are born with Geirus, now the question is, okay, you set up Ubar Yerech Imo as one goof and Ubar Lav Yerech Imo as separate goofim. So there's a Maisa Tefillah on each goof, and the Maisa Tefillah of the aim is not it's not a Maisa Tefillah on the Ubar. The Ubar needs a separate Maisa Tefillah, so that the Tefillah is now it's a general Tefillah on the aim, and it's a Tefillah on the Ubar and on the other Ubar. However, even if I hold Uber Yat Lav Yerech Imo, as far as the Geirus is concerned, the Chalosa Geirus, not the Maisa Geirus. The Maisa Geirus is on the goof. The Tefillah is on the goof. Lav Yerech Imo means we need a Maisa Geirus and a Maisa Tefillah on each Ubar. But as far as the Chalos Geirus is concerned, says Reb Chaim, it's one Chalos Geirus on all the above, on the aim, on the Ubar, on the other Ubar. It's one Chalos Geirus. And therefore, if it's one Chalos Geirus, then there's not a separate Geirus to set up the halacha of Katan Shenolad. Because whenever it's one Geirus for both, then we don't apply the principle of Katan Shenolad. And they're Achim Mina'im, and therefore there's an Iser Erva. And Reb Chaim explains, he says the following, that the machlokas between Uber Yerech Imo, Lav Yerech Imo, is on the goof, on the chefta, he calls it, using Reb Chaim's terminology. Is it one chefta, the aim and the ubar, or is it two different cheftas? If it's two different cheftas, then you need a Maisa Tefillah on each chefta, on each goof, and that's called Uber Lav Yerech Imo. But as far as the Gavra is concerned, it's one Gavra to generate one Chalos Geirus on the aim and the Ubar. Even if I hold what? Ubar Lav Yerech Imo. And that's why the Gemara says that these two Achim are related, because since there's one Geirus, they are now misguided together with the mother, and it's not a separate Geirus. There's no Geirus for Ruvain and a Geirus for Shimon. There was a Maisa Tvila for Ruvain and a Maisa Tvila for Shimon, but the Geirus itself in Chalos, it's not two Chalosim of Geirus as a separate Geirus for Ruvain and for Shimon, or for the mother and the Ubar, but rather it's one Chalos Geirus. And if it's one Chalos Geirus, then they are attached to each other in the laws of Arayas because they are Achim in Ha'em, because they underwent one single Geirus. When there's a separate Geirus, Reb Chaim argues, then we're going to apply the principle of Katan Shenolad Dam. But if it's one Geirus together and one Chalos, then these are two brothers. And there's no Katan Shenolad Dam that would separate one brother from the other. Says Reb Chaim, let me just finish one more thing, Ari, just the last punchline. Says Reb Chaim, if this be the case, that even if I hold Uber Lav Yerech Imo, it's still one Chalos Geirus and it's one Gavra, then we have an answer to Rabbi Kivega's Kasha. The reason why Ger Katan is the Oraisa, says Tosfos, is because we're talking about a Muberes, she's Gaira. So Rabbi Kivega asks, okay, that's if Uber Yerech Imo. But if Uber Lav Yerech Imo, then you're going to have to set up two different Geirus, two different Chaloyos, one Chalos on the mother, another Chalos on the Ubar, and then you're going to have to operate with Zachar the other Shlo B'fana, because the Das of the mother now has to be Chal to set up a separate Geirus on the child. Says Reb Chaim, that's not so. Because even if I hold Uber Lav Yerech Imo, it's not a separate Geirus. The Geirus of the mother and the Geirus of the child of the Ubar is one indivisible Geirus because it's one Gavra. And therefore, if it's one Geirus, I don't need to operate with Zachar the Older Fanav. I don't need that the Geirus of the mother with her Das should generate a Das on behalf of the Katan, on behalf of the Ubar, because it's one Chalos Geirus, even if I hold Ubar Lav Yerechim. Sorry.
Then the child need a tefillah or won't need it?
No, nobody says the child needs a tefillah. We're saying that conceptually it's a separate tefillah. Imagine there's no chatzitza. Who goes into the mikveh? Not only the mother dips herself in the mikveh, but the Uber dips himself into the mikveh while the mother's pregnant. So the tefillah works as a double tefillah if I hold Uber Lav Yerech Imo. If I hold Uber Yerech Imo, it's one guf, right? Yerech Imo means it's an aver of the mother, and therefore it's one tefillah for one guf. If I hold Lav Yerech Imo, I need a separate Maisa tefillah. But both Maisa tefillahs occur or implemented simultaneously when she goes down into the mikveh, because the Uber is also going down into the mikveh. So now we have two Maisa tefillahs if I hold Uber Lav Yerech Imo. But Reb Chaim's Chiddush is that's only as far as the Maisa Geirus is concerned. But as far as the Chalos Geirus, it's one Chalos Geirus that's inseparable, that includes both the mother and the Ubar. And if that be the case, we understand two things. We understand the Yevamos Daf Tzadi Zayin, meaning that the two twins are brothers in Dini Arayas, because there was one Chalos Geirus on both of them, even if I hold Lav Yerech Imo. And number two, I answer Kivega's Kasha, how Tosfos could possibly get away with the point that there's no din of Schia here, and there's one Geirus, and Tosfos presumably would satisfy even the Mandiyama who says Lav Yerech Imo. How's that possible? Reb Kivega screams, because if Lav Yerech Imo, we need a separate Geirus on the Ubar, and if we need a separate Geirus on the Ubar, then you're gonna have to relate the das of the mother in her Geirus to the child and his Geirus, but then you're operating with Zachar Adam, and you're back to square one, because Chia Lekatan is the Rabbanan, it's not the Oraisa. But now that Reb Chaim has answered this question by telling us that you're right, Uber Lav Yerech Imo means we need a separate Tevila, both for the mother and the Uber. Again, that's all conceptual. In reality, it's one Tevila, if you know what I mean. But it's really two different Maisa Tevilas. But as far as the Geirus is concerned, it's one Geirus for both the mother and the Ubar. And in the case of two Ubrim, Ta'omim, it's one Geirus for the mother and the Ta'omim. Because it's only one Chalos Geirus.
Why is only one Chalos? There's three masters and one chalas.
Correct.
Right? With the-
Three meisim and one chalos. That's what comes out. Because in Gavra, it's one Gavra. And that was never a question. Even the Mandi Omar who dissented and insisted that Uber Lav Yerech Imo, he never meant to say that Uber is a separate Gavra. No. The Uber certainly, according to everyone, is one Gavra with the mother. And therefore it's one Chalos Geirus. And that's why they're born as brothers to one mother. They're both Achim and Aim. Because there was one Geirus. If it's only when you have a separate Geirus, then if there's a separate Geirus, then we're going to apply the principle of Katan Shenola Domi. But within the same Geirus, you don't apply the principle of Katan Shenola Domi because it's all one Geirus. Again, if you're asking a philosophical why, I can't answer that question.
Right.
If you're asking what is happening here, if your Lumdisha approach is to get the mechanics down, how does it work? And how could it be that these two Achim are considered Achim, Mina'im, with the Isol Arayas Savacious Ach, if Uber Lav Yerachimo? That question I can answer. What is the mechanism by which it works? You know, as Reb Chaim created a beautiful structure in which he differentiates between the Maisa and the Chalos. And within that structure, he gives you a whole new perspective on the machlokas about Uber Yerech and Lav Yerech.
But how do you get to the chalos as one chalos?
Because otherwise there are two sugyas that make no sense, including the entire entity of Ger Katan. Reb Chaim was not willing to take Ger Katan and throw it overboard. Tosfos himself is going to come up with another enterprise of Ger Katan, which we'll see later on. But Yesh Koch B'Yad Chachamim Lakar Dog Min Torah, which again even Tosfos himself admits it's very difficult to say so. So the simple way of Tosfos of coming up with Ger Katan Doraisa is through a Muberes. Now we're going to have to conclude that mechanism of Muberes, according to Tosfos, works even if I hold the Uber Lav Yerech Imo. And the question is how? Rabbi Kivega didn't understand how that, because Rabbi Kivega didn't have the distinction between the Maisa Geirus and the two Gufim, in which case Uber Lav Yerech Imo means we need a separate Maisa Geirus, and the Chalos Geirus. He understood in his mind that if you need a separate Maisa Geirus, then it's a separate Chalos Geirus, which means you're operating with Zechia. Reb Chaim's breakthrough is that no, even if I hold the Uber Lav Yerech Imo, but it's still considered one Gavra, that no one can question that. It's only an issue of Gufim Mechulakim. If it's Gufim Mechulakim, I need a separate mice. Let me give you an example. What's an example? Yeah, what do you say?
You put Sami twins in a mikvah.
That's what we're talking about. I don't know if we're talking about Chinese twins, but we're talking about twins. Are they paternal twins, fraternal twins? I don't know. Whatever. Siamese twins, whatever. I'll give you whatever you like.
No, they're connected.
You can't have a case where she's pregnant with twins and only one becomes Ger.
No, that's true even before Reb Chaim.
Why? If you
But
say
before Reb Chaim, we're dealing with Zachin Li'adam. Do you understand? According to Reb Kiva Eger, true that both twins are Gerim. Reb Kiva Eger is not questioning that. Reb Kiva Eger is questioning by what mechanics both of them are Gerim. And he's saying that it's because there's a separate Maisa Tefillah for each Ubar, and the Das of the mother supplies the Das Geirus to generate a Chalos for each Ubar. That's how Rabbi Kiva Eger understood it. And then Rabbi Kiva Eger is stuck with the following problem. If there's a separate Chalos Geirus for each Ubar, then Kikot Shenola Dami, how could you consider their Achim? Or, as Rabbi Kiva Eger asked in the context of Atosa, how can you get a Geret Katan without Zochel Yodam Shalom fun of it? It's a separate Chalos Geirus. The mother is supplying a Das for the Chalos Geirus of the Ubar. Says Reb Chaim Nein. You're talking about whether it's one Maisa Tefillah or two Maisa Tefillahs. Does each need a separate Maisa Tefillah? That depends on Yerech Imo or Lav Yerech Imo. But if you're talking about the Chalos Geirus, then even if I hold Lav Yerech Imo, see what Reb Chaim is doing is he's whittling down the Stei Akrav, the Machlokas. It's, if you're familiar, you remember I quoted Rav Zevin, did I quote Rav Zevin or not? Or maybe I forgot to quote Rav Zevin. Anyway, Rav Zevin has a thing about just give me a second. About Pirivarivya in the case of a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin. Why? Because the Chatzi Ben Chorin is Chayv and Pirivarivya, and the Chatzi Eved generates an Iser of what's it called? Of Kedeshus. Right? For a Bas Yisrael to be married to an Eved is an Iser of Losia Kodesh B'Yisrael. So how do you operate with this? Anyway, Rav Zevin in his Sefer, which is called Ishim V'Shitot, it's a magnificent Sefer. All of Rav Zevin's Sfarim are magnificent. But he has a Masorah in Reb Chaim that although, as far as period review is concerned, there are two cheftzas here. One is a cheftzah ben chorin, and one is a cheftzah of an Evan. In Gavra, they're one Gavra. And that's going to help us understand how we're going to apply Esei Dochalosas, and the Tzad Ben Chorin is going to override the Tzad Avdus and nullify the Isur Kedeshus. Again, if you want, we could go through it. It's a beautiful piece in the name of Reb Chaim. But again, that language of Reb Chaim, that the two Cheftas and one Gavra, is something that we're familiar with. This is not the first time we're encountering. Now, what's the case of Uber Lav Yerachimo? So the Gemara in Chulin has a question of the following. You have a pregnant animal, and you have a person who violated B'Shogeg and Isakares. He needs what? A Korban Chatos. And what he does is, he's Magdish this animal for a Chatos. The animal is pregnant. And now the question is, whether or not he was Magdish two animals as a Chatos, which is fine, and then the Hekdesh is Chal on one, and the other one is what's called Yirat Sheyistoy. Or do we say no? He was only Magdish the mother, and there's no Hakdasha on the Vlad. And if there's no Hakdasha on the Vlad, that's called Vlad Chatos. There are 5 Chatos Mesos. One of them is called Vlad Chatos. Sul Halach L'Moshe B'Sinai. And the Gemara says it depends upon whether Uber Yerach Imo or Lav Yerach Imo. Again, what Reb Chaim is going to say is that the question is whether he needs a separate Maisa Magdish to be Magdish the mother and the Uber, the mother animal and the Uber. If you hold the Uber Yerach Imo, then there's one Hakdasha on both the mother and the Vlad. And if that be the case, then when the Vlad is born, it's born as a Vlad Chatos. But if you hold Uber Lav Yerach Imo, then it's a separate Maisa Hakdash on the Uber, because the Uber is a separate Guf, and therefore it's not a Vlad Chatos, it's an original Chatos. And therefore he can decide whether he wants to bring the mother as a Chatos or the Vlad. But again, you see very clearly that we're not dealing with a separate Gavra when we say Uber Lav Yerach Imo. What we're dealing with is whether or not the Maisa Hakdasha is Chal on the Uber as a separate Maisa Hakdasha. And in this case, it works Lakula, because if there's a separate Maisa Hakdasha on the Uber, then you don't have the problem of Vlad Chatos, because the Uber was an original Hakdasha. If you follow, and again, we're not learning Chulin now, but just to give you a flavor of how you'd apply Reb Chaim's logic in the sugya of Uber Lav Yerach Imo. So Uber Lav Yerach Imo means a separate Guf, and in Hilchas Hakdasha, to be Magdish an animal, it requires its own separate Hakdasha. And he was Magdish the Uber as a separate Guf. Once he was Magdish the Uber as a separate Guf, then you don't have a problem with Vlad Chatos. Okay, I'm just giving you an example of how we can operate with Reb Chaim.
So this would be the only kind of situation where you have two brothers that are Gerim but are actually related.
As far as I know, I mean, maybe you can come up with another case. I don't know. Now the problem I'm going to raise.
Because I know that's Ger when they're 13 or whatever they.
Yeah, we'll get to that soon. That was the question of Higduli Cholim Limchos. But before we get to that, I want to point out that there are a few words here in Tosfos that we didn't read yet that are a little bit problematic. Tosis writes, the Efshar Hashta, the Achrechein, Yoreshes Imo. Let's try to understand what these words mean. Just al derech hapshat. Tosis vacillates about the following question. If the mother is pregnant and she undergoes Geirus, and then she gives birth to this ubar, Tosis wants to know, will that ubar, after it's born, when it grows up, can inherit its mother? Are you with me so far? Just the pashut shot in the words of Tosis.
So
The
it's
Efshar.
related to the mother and the Geirus.
Correct. He's the son of his mother, and therefore he'd be Yoresh.
Normally, if you're a ger, you're not related. Anymore.
Correct. Otherwise,
Why is it different?
Tosis says he will not be Yoresh his mother because Katan Shenoladon. What's going on over here? We just established that two brothers that were Ubrim B'mei Imo are related to each other by Rayas and Osabeshis Ach. We just established that even if I hold Uber Lav Yerech Imo, there's one Chalos Geirus on both the mother and the Ubar. And if that be the case, then this Ubar is clearly the ben of his mother. And yet Tosis used the word what? Efshar, meaning Tosis is unsure about it. How could Tosis be unsure about it when he's just established? And according to Reb Chaim, he established it according to everybody without any dissenting opinion, that there's one Geirus on both the mother and the Ubar. And that's why they're related to each other. Like a mother is related to a son, or two brothers are related because they have the same mother, in the case of Ta'omim that we spoke about in Yevomis. And therefore, why shouldn't it be Yorish's mother when she died? So this is the part of my shir tonight that's very complicated. And I don't even think I understand it myself. But apparently, what Tosis is implying is that when you're talking about relationships, when you talk about blood relatives, if we could use that term, then there are different areas of halacha that operate with different rules and regulations. For example, when we talk about arayis, that's what we call she'er basar, there are one set of rules. When you're talking about Yerusha, that's already not halacha of she'er basar, that's halacha mishpacha. We belong to one mishpacha. The rules that operate with regard to mishpacha are not necessarily identical with the rules that operate with she'er basar in Hilchas Arayis and Isurei Arayis. So as far as Isurei Arayis is concerned, there's no doubt that this ben is the ben to his mother. And the two brothers who are Ta'omim are brothers. So that's as far as she'er basar is concerned, as far as Arayis is concerned. But Tosis is not sure if those rules will determine mishpacha as far as Yerusha is concerned. What am I saying? You recall that we're talking about a non-Jewish woman who's pregnant and undergoes Geirus, correct? And that's called hora'asa shelo b'kedusha, v'leidasa b'kedusha. What generates she'er basar as far as arayis? It's leda. The leda was a leda of a son to his mother, or two brothers, one brother to the other. And that applies even if you hold uber lav yerachim, because it's one Geirus. However, it could be, and that's what Tosis is toying with, he's entertaining the idea that as far as mishpacha is concerned, it's not enough that you call it she'er basar. Mishpacha has to go back to the conception, to the holada. I'm sorry, to the hora. Hora without an aleph, right? Hora. Meaning that when do you establish the relationship between a parent and a child? That's at the time of conception. Again, just l'sabres ha'ozen, please. I'm not.
So give me another question. If a soldier or whatever, the person dies before his child is born, but the mother conceived, and that
Could be that's mishpacha. Why?
he would be
Because at the point of conception, you already established mishpacha. Now, why? Again, what I'm about to say is totally wrong in halachic terms, but just l'sabres ha'ozen. Conception is genetic. Do you understand what I mean?
Cool.
What I'm suggesting is that when you want to determine mishpacha, it depends on genetics. Now the genetics here is what's called Horasa Shalom B'Kedusha, which means Al Pi Din, from a perspective of Gerim, they're not related to each other. In other words, if I would focus all my attention exclusively on the Hora, meaning on the conception, then there's no way that you can establish a mishpacha here, because they were, there was a guy with a guy, a mother who's not Jewish with a son who's not Jewish, and later on they become Gerim. So if we want to set up a relation mishpacha that dates back to the moment of conception, we won't be able to do so. But in terms of Sher Basar, all we need is that there's one Chalos Geirus at the time of the Leda, and that Geirus is Chal, so that when the Ubar is pushed out of its mother's womb, that Ubar is the son of its mother and underwent one single Geirus together with his mother.
But the Yibam has Yerusha implication.
Well, yes and no. I mean, again, that might be a reflection of Sher Basar, meaning it could be that once you establish Sher Basar, then in Dini Yerusha, perhaps Yibum is enough. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, Yibum depends on Sher Basar. That depends on Leidasa B'Kedusha. In a case where there's one Geirus of the Muberes. However, if you ask me now whether and now she falls for Yibum to the other brother because they're brothers, right? And now you want to know if he inherits his brother. That could be for a different reason. That could be that's part of the mitzvah of Yibum.
The conversation.
Right, that the Torah was mezakeh the Yibum, the Yavam in Yerusha. Again, I don't know. But again, in a pure theoretical sense, it could be that he doesn't yarshit his brother in this particular scenario of Yibum. No, it's in 99.9% of Yibum, right? They're two brothers, and one brother will inherit the other. However, in this one particular case of Yibum, which was Horasa Shalom B'Kedusha and Leidasa B'Kedusha, I don't know what the din would be as far as Yerusha. Maybe in Yerusha, Tosas is vacillating back and forth. They're not considered brothers because it was Horasa Shalom B'Kedusha. And Mishpacha depends upon what? On Horah. Okay, I'm just mentioning. As I said to you at the outset, I didn't write the script here. There's a very complicated suit. Let's go on. Umiu kasha. May I heed the pericometic subis, the Amrinin ger kat matbilan osal das bez. Ulechol mili kashav ger. Right, Tos is not willing to say that he's only a ger as far as certain dinim. Matbilan osal das bez is a ger gamur, latiro b'bas Yisrael. Right, there's no Yisrael Kadeshus. It's not going to be Akama Bol Bas Yisrael. He's a Jew. Kiddush of Kiddushin. If he marries a woman, she's an Eshes, and if somebody has a relationship with her, he's going to be Chayav Bisa, Bon of Cholzin, Umiyabnim, Ulechol Mili Dorais. Now, Ger Katan is based on what, Rabbosai? We're not talking about a pregnant woman who is Tovelis. It's got to be based on Zechiyah. And we just finished saying that there's no Zechiyah to a Katan because Zechiyah is predicated on what? On Shlichus, and a Katan doesn't have Shlichus. So how could Bezdin supply the Das on behalf of this Katan? It's got to be through the din of Zechiyah, Zachli Olam Shalom B'fanav, and therefore Bezdin, if we grant that Geirus is Schus, which is a sugya in Ksuvas, but let's grant that Geirus is a Schus for this Katan, and through Zachli Adam. But wait a second, we just said that Zachli Adam, according to the sugya in where is it, Dezu Neshech, is only the Rabbanan. And yet we're saying that he's a ger l'chol mili d'oraisa. The Rabbanan could not be matir a guy to marry a Jewish woman, nor would they be able to establish issues between a non-Jew and a Jewish woman. So the kedusha could not be chal d'oraisa. So again, we solved the riddle of how could we ever come up with ger katan d'oraisa. That's the case of Uberes. But if there's another way of establishing a ger katan d'oraisa, namely through ger katan matbil no saldas bezdin, then we're operating with Zach Li'olam Shelo B'fanav. The Gemara says explicitly, black on white in Ksubas Daf Yud Aleph, that we're operating with Zach Li'olam Shelo B'fanav. In fact, the Gemara says, why do I need Rav Huna to teach me that Ger Kadmat Bilon Soldas Bezdin? We know that Zach Li'olam Shelo B'fanav. So Pshita Maika Mashmo. Is Rav Huna just chazering even the Mishnah? He's telling me what we know from the Mishnah. So now Tosfos throws out a possibility that maybe the Rabbanan, once they established the Chiyuv Katan, they now could flex the muscle of Yesh Koch B'Yad Chachamim Lakar Dovim in Torah. This is wild. You're taking a guy and you're upgrading him to the status of a Jew because Yesh Koch B'Yad Chachamim Lakar Dovim in Torah.
He's saying the Zechir for Katan is the Rabbanan. What's the Rabbanan? So now we can be okay.
If the Geirus is only the Rabbanan because there's no Zechir to a Katan, it's only the Rabbanan, then fine. What are you telling me? That he's a Ger the Rabbanan. But how could the Rabbanan be Oker the Doraisa? They're going to allow him to marry a Jewish girl. He's going to drink the wine and it's not Yayin Nesech. He's going to shecht an animal and it's not an Avela, it's a kosher shchita. How could they do such a thing? Could the Rabbanan create a Ger when on a Doraisa level he's a guy? Because on a Doraisa level there's no Zechir to a Katan. And that's the Sugi B'Mitzvah in Ezu Nesha. That Zechir to a Katan is only rabbinic. Could you imagine, Rabbi, what's going on over here? We're taking a Katan, Bezdin is being Tovilim, making Matvilim, right? Making him into a Ger, and on a Deraisa level, that Geirus can't be effective. Because there's no Zechir to a Katan on the Deraisa level. But the Rabbanan said, yeah, there's Zechir to a Katan. And we're going to apply Zach Li'olam Shelo B'fanav to give this Katan the great schus of being a Jew. And now he's going to marry a Jewish girl. His Kedushin is Kedushin, his Gerushin is Gerushin, his Shchita is Shchita, his Eidus is Eidus, when his Evaitin is Evaitin. He can tell you a million different. And it's all based on the Rabbanan establishing a recognition of his Geirus. Now, we do have a sugya in Yevamis on Daf Tzadi called Yesh Koch B'Yad Chachamim Lakar Dovim in Torah. Like, for example, Gzeira D'Rabba, we don't take the lulav and hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah when it's Chal B'Shabbos. Okay, fine. But that's B'Shevi Altase. Now we're saying Lakar Dovim in Torah. So Tos himself admits that this is really going out on a lark. You know, what's it called? A limb, right? Chada number one, the Hadibili. What koach chacham do they have? That's only b'shevi altase, right? They can tell you not to take the lulav. But b'kuva say to allow a violation of a Torah law and someone who's not Jewish to marry a Jewish girl, that's impossible. Hai kuva sehu. Now Tos has a technical disproof, objection to what he just said, that it's all D'Rabbanan. The Gemara asks, what is Rav Huna telling me a chiddush of Ger Katan? Because we have a Mishnah that says that
makes sense. It's a huge chiddush.
It's a huge chiddush. We're saying that Yesh Koch B'Yad Chachamim Lakar Dover Ben HaTorah B'Kuva Aseh. And the Gemara is going to answer, well, you know what Rav Huna is being mechadish, that to become Jewish is a schus. Right? What's this new popular song that's going around? Right? It's Geschmack zu seiner Yid. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe it didn't hit Israel. If you go to a wedding in America,
I agree with what it says.
If you go to a wedding in America, like the band, I went to a wedding recently in America, and twice the band sang that. So twice, the beginning and at the end, it was such a popular song. Okay, so if Huda wants to teach me that to become Jewish is a schus, well, what do you mean? You're looking high and low for a chiddush of Rav Huna. Forget about that. Rav Huna is telling me that Zachin Li'olam Shelo B'fanav could set up a Ger Katan when the entire enterprise of Zechia for a Katan is only the Rabbanan. That we, Bezdin, will supply the das on behalf of the Katan through Zachin Li'olam Shelo B'fanav. That's an amazing chiddush of Rav Huna, that we could create a Geirus out of nothing. We can make a Ger out of a guy. Flop a yarmulke on his head and he's a ger. Well, what are you talking about? He's not a ger. There's no schia for a katan. There's no das here in this Geirus because zach li'odem doesn't apply to a katan because schia is mitab shlichus. Now, we're going to have to stop soon, but I do want to read a few lines in Tosas just to, I was wondering when I came into Shia today whether we could finish the whole sugya in one Shia. It's such a complicated sugya. And I see now that we cannot, but we can get, I'd say, 90% of the sugya. The last 10% we'll have to see next week. V'nira, it appears to me, D'schia de Geirus lo dami l'shar zchuyos. That even though the Gemara gives us the insight that Rav Huna's Ger Katan Matbilos is predicated, and what underlies Rav Huna's Geirus of a Ger Katan is Zechia, but it's not Zechia. It is Zechia, but it's not Zechia. It's a unique Zechia in the constellation of Hilchas Zechia. Why? Demashe Bezdin Matbilan also, Einom Zochin Ba'avura. The language of Tosfos is very heavy here. He says in classical Zechia, the Masechet is doing something on behalf of the Zocher. Well, what's that called? Give me a word for that. In every Zocher Li'olam Shelo B'fanav, what happens? He's doing what? A Maisa. He's doing a Maisa. You follow what say? I do a Maisa on your behalf. Let's say I do a Kinyan on your behalf, and that's Zocher Li'olam Shelo B'fanav. Not so in the case of Bezdin being Makvil a Katan. Elahu Zocha B'yatzmo B'gufo. Who is going into the mikvah? It's not the Dayana that are jumping into the mikvah as a Maisa Tvila on behalf of the Ger, on behalf of the Katan. That wouldn't operate. That wouldn't get off the ground. But rather the Katan himself goes into the mikvah. So that we're not operating here within the bounds and the constrictions of Zocha the Adam Shlo B'fanav, which means that the Maisa of the Zocha as a Shliach is operating on behalf, the Mazaka on behalf of the Zocha. El Shenasa Ger v'nichnas tachas kanfei Ashchina. He will enter into Geirus on his own bi'atzmo begufo, not because of a Maisa that was done on his behalf and operates through Zoch and the Yodem Fana. But wait a minute. Rabbeinu at Tosfos, the Gemara says the following: Haparach b'ksubis Tnina Zoch and the Yodem Shlo B'fana. The Gemara itself says that Rav Huda's Ger Katan Matbilos Al Das Bezdin is predicated on Zoch and the Yodem Shlo B'fana. Now Tosfos saying no, that's not Zoch and B'fana because begufo bi'atzmo nasa Ger, he himself, the child, goes down into the mikvah, and there's no Maisa on behalf. Implemented by the Bezdin on behalf of the Katan, but yet the Gemara says it's all based on Zachar the Yodem Shlo B'fanav. Okay, then. So we'll stop here. I mean, wow, this is it's a doozy of a Tosfos and a doozy of a sugya. I don't know what. Yeah. Okay, then.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.